All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We are diving into something pretty big today.
Yeah.
The personal is political.
Yes.
So this is an essay by Carol Hanisch, and it's something you actually brought to us.
Yeah, this is a great one. This is a foundational text, I think, for second wave feminism. And it's from the late 60s, so it's a text that's been around for a while, but it's still so relevant today. And I think that's why we keep coming back to these kinds of texts, in part because they were so prescient, but in part because the problems that they outline are still so present.
Yeah, and I think it's a good one because this is something that, we've heard this phrase, like I feel like people have heard the personal is political, but I'm not sure that everybody knows exactly where that comes from.
Right.
Or the full context of it.
Yeah.
So before we jump into it, maybe we can just give a little bit of context in terms of like, okay, what is this essay? Where did it come from?
Yeah.
And, when was it written?
Sure. So this essay actually started as a memo, and it was written in February 1969. So we're, really in the heart of, kind of late 60s social movements. It was written in Gainesville, Florida, which is maybe a little bit of a surprising place for some people because it was written in the South. But there was a very active women's liberation movement in Gainesville at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was actually written in response to a question. So Carol Hanisch was on staff at an organization called Southern Conference Educational Fund. And another staff member named Dottie Zellner was questioning whether consciousness raising, which was a key practice in the women's liberation movement, she was wondering if it was just therapy. And that was a question that Carol Hanisch was really responding to in this memo. And then it was later published in 1970 in an anthology called Notes from the Second Year, Women's Liberation. So this is really kind of a text that's emerging, very organically out of conversations and debates that were happening within the women's liberation movement in these early years.
And I think it's interesting that it starts as a memo, too.
Yeah.
It's not like somebody set out to write this grand treatise on this.
Right.
It was really just a response to a question that somebody had. And then it obviously, gained some traction from there.
Yeah.
So, at the heart of this essay, at the heart of this memo, is this very powerful argument.
Yeah.
Right. And that is, and I think that's kind of what we all know the essay for, is this statement that the personal is political.
Exactly.
So, how would you, for somebody who maybe isn't as familiar with the essay or the concept, how do you unpack that? Like, what does that mean?
Well, so the central argument that Hanisch is making in this essay is that what we often perceive as personal problems are actually symptoms of larger political and social structures. So in other words, she's arguing that our individual experiences, the things that we go through in our personal lives, are not just random or isolated incidents. They're actually connected to these broader systems of power and inequality. So she gives a lot of examples in the essay. She talks about, women's experiences in marriage and relationships, the division of household labor, the pressures that women face around beauty and sexuality. All of these things she's arguing are not just personal problems that each individual woman has to deal with on her own, but they're actually reflections of these larger social and political forces that are shaping women's lives.
So I think maybe an easy way to think about it would be to say, like, if you have one woman who is feeling trapped in a marriage or feeling, like she's doing all of the housework, you could say, okay, well, that's just her individual experience.
Right.
But when you have thousands and millions of women,
yeah,
exactly all over the country, all having the same experience, then it starts to point to something bigger than just that one person's issue.
That's exactly right. And that's what Hanisch is really trying to get at. It's like, if you're seeing these patterns repeating themselves over and over again, then it's probably not just a coincidence. It's probably not just a matter of individual, failings or bad choices. It's likely that there's something structural going on.
And this is something that she was responding to because she was talking about how, some people, I think particularly men on the left, were kind of dismissing these consciousness-raising groups as therapy.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a big part of this essay, too.
Yeah. So this was a really important debate that was happening within the women's liberation movement at the time. And Hanisch was very critical of this idea that consciousness raising was just therapy. And I think it's important to remember that, in the late 60s, the word therapy had a very particular connotation. It was often associated with, psychoanalysis and with this idea that there was something wrong with you individually that needed to be fixed. And Hanisch's argument was that women weren't sick. There wasn't something wrong with them individually. They were responding rationally to the conditions that they were living in.
Right.
So to say that they just needed therapy was to completely miss the point.
And what did she see as the true purpose of these groups?
So for Hanisch, the purpose of consciousness raising was really about political education. It was about women coming together and sharing their experiences, listening to each other and starting to see the connections between their own personal lives and these larger systems of power. And she argued that this process of sharing and listening and analyzing was absolutely essential for building a strong and effective movement.
So she also talks in the essay about self-blame.
Right.
And how these groups can help women move away from self-blame.
Right. And I think this is a really crucial part of the essay because Hanisch is arguing that one of the ways that patriarchy maintains its power is by convincing women that their problems are their own fault. So if a woman is unhappy in her marriage, it's because she picked the wrong man. Or if she's struggling to make ends meet, it's because she doesn't know how to manage her money.
Right.
And Hanisch is saying, no, that's not how it works. Yeah. These problems are not the result of individual failings. They're the result of a system that is designed to keep women in a subordinate position.
Right. And I think she also connects that to other movements, right?
Yeah.
Like she just comes about the Black movement and workers as well.
Exactly. She makes these really interesting connections between the women's liberation movement and other social justice movements. So she talks about how, in the Black movement, there was this process of Black people coming together and realizing that, the problems that they were facing were not because they were, inferior or because they weren't working hard enough. It was because of a system of white supremacy that was designed to keep them down.
Right.
And she's arguing that the same thing is true for women. Women need to stop blaming themselves for their problems and start seeing those problems as the result of a system of patriarchy that is designed to keep them in a subordinate position.
Right. So the next thing she talks about, and this is interesting too, I think, is this idea of action versus analysis.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is a really important point. And this is something that I think a lot of social movements struggle with is, what's the right balance between taking action and doing the kind of the intellectual work, the analysis of trying to understand the problem.
Right.
And Hanisch's argument is that you need both. You can't just have action without analysis because then you're likely to be taking the wrong actions or you're not going to be as effective as you could be. Yeah. But you also can't just have analysis without action.
Right.
You have to actually do something with the knowledge that you're gaining. And so she's really pushing for this kind of dialectical relationship between action and analysis.
So what's an example she uses?
So she uses the example of the Miss America protest, which was a really famous protest that happened in 1968. And she's not saying that the Miss America protest was, the most important thing that the women's liberation movement ever did. But she's using it as an example of an action that was grounded in analysis. So the women who organized that protest, they had spent a lot of time thinking about how beauty standards are used to control women and how, the Miss America pageant was really just a symbol of this larger system of objectification.
Right.
And so their protest was informed by that analysis.
Okay. And then she moves into something else, which I thought was really interesting and is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, which is this idea of listening to the so-called apolitical woman.
Yes. This is such an important point. And I think it's one that often gets overlooked. So, in the women's liberation movement, as in any social movement, there's a tendency to kind of, circle the wagons and to think that everybody who's not with us is against us. And Hanisch is saying, no, we need to be reaching out to women who are not already part of the movement. And she's particularly interested in these women who are often dismissed as apolitical, women who are not, going to protests or writing radical pamphlets.
Right.
And she's saying, we need to listen to these women. We need to understand why they're not involved in the movement.
Because they might not be apolitical.
Exactly.
They just may not agree with you on how things should be done.
Exactly. They might have, different experiences. They might have different priorities. They might have different ideas about what liberation looks like. And Hanisch is saying, if we want to build a truly inclusive movement, we need to be open to those different perspectives. And I think that's so important, especially today when, we have such a polarized political landscape.
Right.
It's so easy to just kind of retreat into our own little echo chambers and talk to the people who already agree with us. And Hanisch is saying, no, we need to be doing the opposite. We need to be talking to the people who don't agree with us. We need to be trying to understand where they're coming from.
So to wrap this all up then, I mean, what do you think is the main takeaway of the personal is political?
I think there are so many important takeaways from this essay, but if I had to boil it down to one thing, I would say that it's this idea that we need to stop seeing our personal lives as separate from politics.
Right.
Our personal experiences are shaped by political forces, and our personal choices have political consequences. And so if we want to create a more just and equitable world, we need to start paying attention to those connections.
And thinking about, what are the ways that our own personal experiences can inform, our political beliefs and our political actions.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that's a great place to leave it. But before we go, I do want to leave our listeners with one final question.
Okay.
And it's this. Think about an issue that you're really passionate about. And it could be anything. It could be climate change. It could be, economic inequality. It could be racial justice. Whatever it is, think about that issue and then think about how it's showing up in your own life.
Yeah.
How is it affecting you personally? How is it affecting your family? How is it affecting your community? And once you've kind of reflected on that, then think about what you can do to address that issue, and not just on a personal level, but on a political level as well.
Yeah. How can we take that personal understanding and turn it into collective action?
Exactly. All right. Thanks so much.